Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adapting Your Data Security Strategy to the Latest Cyber Threats. We've got a fun, freewheeling discussion for you today, and I can't wait to get started. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. But first, there are a few housekeeping items that'll help you get the most out of this session. We want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions of our panelists in the questions box in your webinar control panel. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be having. Now, our browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Second, check out the handout section in the panel, which is right next to the questions tab. There you'll find a number of really important resources, including a link to help you get started with Rubrik. You'll also find links to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's huge library of printed resources on various technology topics. You'll also see a link to the Actual Tech Media Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, including probably numerous ones that will interest you. So explore that handout section. And finally, at the end of this webinar, we'll be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Now, you must be in attendance during the live event the entire time to qualify for the prize. You can find the official terms and conditions of the prize drawing also in the handout section, which I referenced before. And with that, let's get to today's awesome content. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our expert panel today. Joining us are Stephen Stone, Jens Mondrad, Deepan Desai, and Kevin Perot. Yeah, we have a full house of experts, and they'll be taking us on a deep dive into the latest cyber threats and how to protect your organization from them. Kevin Perot is leading the roundtable, so Kevin, the floor is yours.
My name is Kevin Poirot. I'm a reporter at InfoSecurity magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this session. For the next 60 minutes, we are going to explore findings from different recent reports on the cyber threat landscape and discuss how organizations can use insights from these to protect their data, their crown jewels of the modern corporate world. We will primarily use Rubrik Zero Labs Spring Report on Data Security, Mandiant's 2023 edition of their annual M-Trends report, and Zscaler's latest Threat Labs phishing report, since our three wonderful speakers, whom I'm going to introduce in a minute, have been working on lately in the past couple of months. By the way, all these reports can be found attached to this session. But before I introduce you to our panel of speakers, I'll just run through a few bits of housekeeping. First, know that you can submit any question that you might have for our panel using the question button at the bottom of the video screen. And you can note if a question is for a particular speaker, and we'll do our best to answer it before the end of the webinar. We will also be running some polls throughout the session, so please do join in with those. As usual, there's no right or wrong answers. We're just very interested to know your opinions. And this session also qualifies members of ISC Squared, EC Council, and ISACA for 1 CPE credit for 50 minutes or half a CPE credit for 25 minutes. In order to claim your credit, you will need to log into your InfoSecurity magazine account and download your CPE certificate. You are then responsible for submitting this to your accreditation body. Please just note that certificates will be processed and made available to download 48 hours after your viewing. Also, you need to enter your CPE number at registration, and CPE certificates cannot be created retrospectively. So please take note of that. For those who are members of other accreditation bodies, every attendee will receive after the webinar, every attendee will receive an automated email which says thank you for attending, and you will be able to send this to your accreditation body. You can find more information on these in the CP instructions document also attached to the webinar. Now, let me introduce our wonderful speakers who are here to talk about some of their findings. Stephen, do you want to start?
Thanks, Kevin. Steve Stone. I head up Rubrik Zero Labs over on the Rubrik side, where we focus on threat research, focused on primarily data and data security. Background includes time in the U.S. military, time in the U.S. intelligence community, and then in the private sector before Rubrik at Mandiant, FireEye, and IBM. So excited to join this group.
Thank you, Stephen. Deepan?
Yeah, Deepan Desai. I'm the CISO and head of security research at Zscaler. I'm responsible for both the internal security and security research arm over here. Have been always on the private sector side, always on the vendor side as well. And for past 9 years, I've been with Zscaler.
Thank you, Deepan. And Jens, do you want to finally introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. And hi, everybody. My name is Jens. I'm the head of Mandiant Threat Intelligence in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Now part of Google, where we are residing inside Google Cloud. I've been with Mandiant for almost 10 years, working in different roles, primarily focusing on principal analyst tasks and providing context on state-sponsored espionage campaigns to relevant stakeholders.
Well, thank you all three of you for joining us on this wonderful webinar where we'll be talking about your findings. As many of you know, while the ransomware is still very high, the ransomware threat is still very high, now comes a lot of data breaches and hack and leak campaigns. They are rising even more quickly than ransomware, according to some reports. In November 2022, Rubrik Zero Labs reported that 52% of IT and security decision makers suffered from a data breach that year, and 51% from ransomware attacks. In its latest webinar published on April the 18th, Rubrik Zero Labs took a hard look at how organizations deal with the realities of data security at the ground level. We will then start this session with Stephen, who is going to present some of the findings from this report. Then our panel of speakers will discuss the latest insights on data security from their own perspectives and how security teams should be adapting their strategies in light of these trends. Stephen, I leave the floor to you.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I'll go through just a few kind of quick points because I really am interested to get into the discussion with Jens and Deepan. Really excited to see. What I'd really start off by saying is what we focused on in this report was what's inside of data security. I don't want to speak for everyone's experience, but in my experience, data security means different things to different people. It's fairly well undefined. It's pretty squishy. So what we wanted to do was go after what we thought were some pragmatic touch points and how we can provide that so we can have more of a granular discussion around data security. So that was the focus of this report. What's interesting, and I'll touch on three different areas here, is I want to talk a little bit about the methodology. I think it will explain, how we approach things, and I think it's really relevant to this panel. I just want to give three quick takeaways and then an example of each, so then we can really pivot to discussions across the three of us. But what I'd start off by saying is we did something different with this report. We did a few things different. The first time that we've ever used Rubrik telemetry is in this report. So we're speaking about what can Rubrik see from our vantage point securing organizations' data. That became one set of the data. The second was we engaged in some external research and particularly focused on two different types of audiences. The first way we split it was we wanted to focus on IT and security leaders. So we engaged about 800 of each across the globe, focused on 10 different countries. We really have, in our experience, seen there's two different types of organizations, and they may or may not work well together. So we wanted to engage both of those. The other way we wanted to slice this audience up was we wanted to really focus on senior leaders and see what's impacting them. So about half of these individuals resided at the CIO and CISO position, and the other half were at VP or senior director. So we want to be upfront on that. On our external research, it's really focused around senior leaders and their situations, which may not be the same when it comes to what a total environment looks like. And the last piece is we worked with 4 other cybersecurity organizations to integrate their data sets on areas where frankly, we at Rubrik have poor visibility, or we're just not the experts on, one of which was Mandiant. So really excited to have Jens on here. But as an example, we worked with Mandiant around how long are attackers typically in environments before they're detected. That's not a viewpoint that Rubrik really has very well from our standpoint, or like in our recent partnership announcement with Zscaler. Zscaler has excellent data around phishing. We in Rubrik don't. We don't really see initial compromise based on what we do as an organization. So we wanted to use these 3 different data sets to allow us to look at core problems across a range of areas. And it's really as simple as we wanted to ask machine questions, and we see that in Rubrik telemetry. We wanted to ask people questions, which we see that in the external research, again, geared towards the senior leader. And then 3, we wanted to round that out with areas where we're not the best experts in, and work with a number of organizations that do have really critical expertise there. We thought that this gave us a holistic and as objective as you can be viewpoint on these key topics. So I won't go through the whole report. I know we're here wanting to talk about how these 3 reports weave together, but there's 3 big takeaways I'd really like to hit on, and we'll touch each of these with an example. The first is the future is not cloud. The future is not SaaS. The future is hybrid. And as we think about that, we've got to be able to secure hybrid environments. So when we talk about data security, infrastructure security, cybersecurity, the first big takeaway from our viewpoint is we have to have our minds around those environments are hybrid, meaning a mix of cloud, on-premises, and SaaS. That's what a modern organization uses to operate. The second, as we really examined risk and resiliency are core focus areas at Rubrik. Where is the data in that risk categorization? Now, what we have found, and I don't think this will surprise anybody, all of the inherent risk and intrusions is about the data. It's not about how many hosts are compromised. It's not about the initial vector. While those things are really important, when we come to risk assessments and evaluating resiliency, the data is usually the most impactful piece. And we'll talk about what some of that risk is. And then the last piece is, as we looked at a lot of this, what really kind of came through is it's very easy to see the negative. It's very easy to see the new intrusions, especially in the vendor space, which all 3 of us on this call are from. That's what we talk about. We talk about the new intrusion, the new TTP, and those tend to be a very negative conversation. When we looked at a very macro view, we saw lots of positive improvements, and we want to speak a little bit about that. So there's a lot more in the report, but I want to just kind of give an example of each of these 3 main areas, because I think it gives us good discussions across Rubrik, Mandiant, and Zscaler. So starting with hybrid, at a Rubrik level, we're securing almost 30 exabytes of data, which is a really large number. It's hard to categorize. And the way I would summarize it is, if you took every word ever spoken in every language for all of human history and recorded it in an audio file, that'd be about 5 exabytes. So we're securing about 6 times the volume of data of every word ever spoken in all of history. But that's hard to convert to an organization. That doesn't mean much when you really neck down to where organizations operate. So we looked at that. What does a typical organization look like? And a typical organization secures about 227 backend terabytes. I want to be clear about that too. That's not the overall volume. We dedupe that, we compress it. So most organizations have more logical data than this, but this is what we're physically storing and securing. That backend terabytes becomes a pretty critical measure for data storage. But what we see is that's spread across cloud, SaaS, and on-prem. You can see the numbers there. And then the other piece is we tend to talk about these containers, for a simple term, as if they're standalone and either or, and that just isn't how it operates. From a Rubrik perspective, from our data, almost half of our clients are using Rubrik to secure data in all 3 of these, that mix of on-prem, cloud, and SaaS. And the vast majority are doing 2 of the 3. So what we really see here is this isn't just about which one of these are you in, it's are you in all of these. The other piece is, again, let's just take cloud as an example. We talk about cloud as a thing. What we actually see is most organizations are securing multiple clouds, and about a third of organizations are securing clouds across multiple vendors. So it's typical for us to get in conversations about you use AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. The reality is most organizations use a mix of 2 of the 3, and a third of them are using multiple concurrently for large scale data storage. And then if we want to really get cute and look at it, these boundaries kind of fall down at scale, because as an example, even the organizations that are securing data on premises are often backing that up or storing parts of that in the cloud. So even on-premises data ends up in the cloud in a wide range of events. So this is the first part is we talk about the difficulties securing a modern organization. This is why. This is part of why that is. You're actually securing lots of different types of environments concurrently, and there's nuance and challenges in every one of those. The next piece of this, though, is it's really that these environments are all growing. We looked at organizations, and we often talk about this as a static thing, which is not how environments work, and data definitely doesn't work that way. But we tend to think about, we put data down somewhere and we come back, it's still there. And that's not true. It's growing, it's moving, and a typical organization has seen its data grow about 25% in a single year. And then if we extrapolate that out, if we keep that growth rate, which we actually think will get higher, but let's stay with the known, that means an organization's data is going to triple in the next 5 years. So whatever we think our boundaries and our volume is today, we actually have more of that. And you can see the numbers inside that. What I also thought was pretty interesting inside of data growth is it's not even. On-premises is growing about 20%, and SaaS is growing about 11 times that rate of data growth. So we're seeing quite a bit of change around that. And then you can see from our external research there, these are all being targeted. One of the things we asked these senior leaders is during the cyber attacks you worked in 2022, which parts of these environments were targeted in each of these intrusions? And you can see the numbers there. They're all being targeted in some level across these intrusion events, and often several are being targeted simultaneously. So we thought that that's interesting. We can't just talk about securing the cloud or securing on-prem. We've got to do all of that. The second thing I'd like to really just throw out here for our discussions later on is risk. Risk is really a tough thing to categorize on the vendor side, honestly, from a Rubrik perspective. And I'd be surprised if Mandiant or Zscaler approached it any differently. I think we'll all be of like minds. It's not really up to us to assess an organization's risk. That's an organization's job. However, we can help provide some context for that. And one way we do that is looking at sensitive data. The way that we went out and measured sensitive data across all of these is we just looked at what's inside these containers, and we look for what's tagged as sensitive by the organizations, which typically is, the mainstays, GDPR, HIPAA, CPRA, PII, all those kinds of things. And what we saw is that typical organizations got more than 500,000 files containing sensitive data and almost 25 million sensitive data records in a typical environment. So about a little less than 1 of every 40 files in an entire environment contains sensitive data. But again, those numbers are hard to get our arms around. What does 25 million sensitive data records mean? And while we aren't comfortable assessing risk, we can provide some context. So we took some of these penalties for the mainstays around sensitive data exposure. Again, the GDPR, HIPAA, CPRA, because there's tangible. We can measure it, we can talk about it, and it gives us something to debate. And what's interesting is we applied those guidelines to a typical environment. What we saw was there's enough sensitive data in a typical environment to max out every single measure that we looked at. And we actually had to go with very low-end numbers, and we were still maxing them out. As an example, we take CPRA. CPRA has no max cap, and the lowest assessed fine is $2,500 for an act of negligence. So basically, that's no malice, no malfeasance. It's just, it happened. That's $2,500 typically per record. We applied that just to the sensitive files, and we're already at $1.5 billion. So I don't want to spook anybody. I don't want to sit and say, hey, you're looking at $1 billion fine. That's not what we're saying here. But we're saying that if you just look at the numbers, everything maxes out very, very quickly. I think this tells us we have more sensitive data than a lot of organizations think we have. And also the way that we measure that and penalties and all that are probably not the best measures because they all max out. If everything maxes out, I'm not sure that we have the right scale. So I think this really tells us that with this growing hybrid environment full of sensitive data, we've got a lot of risk there, and it's that risk inside that data. And we need to find a good way to categorize and understand that to get better at resiliency. And then the last piece I'll touch on before we kind of go to the larger discussion, and I really think this is a great topic for us here, is these 3 different data sets allowed us to assess threat landscape and then talk about some perspectives on that. So on this slide, you've actually got external research data, Rubrik data, and then data from 2 different cybersecurity organizations, one of which is Mandiant. And that allows us to really shift around the viewpoint and look at things. So we looked at just ransomware. ransomware is top of mind. We heard from those 1,600 IT and cybersecurity leaders, 40% of them had a successful ransomware intrusion in their production environments last year. We compare that with Mandiant's data from Jens's organization. Basically 1 out of 5 incident response engagements last year were due to ransomware, and Expel, for every single byte they analyzed, 11% of them came back to ransomware or ransomware precursor activities. So that gives us a good context for volume. On the Rubrik side, for our clients who were analyzing and looking for ransomware across the backups, 3 out of 4 of them had some form of anomalous activity we identified back. Doesn't mean it's malicious. It means there's something worth looking at, like mass data deletion. That could be ransomware. That could be the IT shop cleaning up. That could be destroying and deleting an environment to create a new one. It's worth looking at. Half of our organizations observed some form of ransomware attempt in their production environments, and about 15% of Rubrik organizations encountered some form of successful encryption event in their production environment that affected our ability to secure those backups and execute that. So this gives us an organizational viewpoint, but then we're also able to rotate it and look at it from different levels. And let's take a snapshot as an example. A snapshot just means we looked at all of the data in an environment and we secured it and we put it in an immutable backup, which now we can analyze offline. We did that about 27 million times last year. And here's where it's interesting to see the perspective and also the data bias. This is why we want to be upfront about where we get our data from. If you're a Rubrik organization, by default, you have a backup solution. So that's a data bias. You're likely working on resiliency. That's a data bias. And we actually see some of that play out here. Of the organizational viewpoint, again, I'll remind everybody we had 48% target with ransomware. But if we look at just these offline snapshots that we're running and doing analysis against, we only saw 0.004% of these affected by any kind of encryption event. And what that really means is in about 1,100 out of 27 million snapshots we tried to analyze, we could not finish analysis because either there was enough encryption events in the compromised production environment that we could not complete the backup, or there was encrypted data in those environments, which we then brought into the snapshot and took offline and made it immutable, but now we can't analyze it. What's interesting there is that gives a view of how organizations can really affect the outcome. You cannot remove yourself from the threat landscape. You can impact how much that threat landscape affects your organizations. 2 examples we would give here is the 2 100%. I hate 100% and 0%. Those end up being challenging numbers, but we saw some really strong trends here. One is 100% of these encryption events were previously identified as anomalous activity. This speaks very much to like dwell time as an example that Mandiant speaks about in mTrends. What we're really saying here is in every time that there was an encryption event, there was precursor activity that was identified that most organizations use to their advantage to prevent encryption. And then of these events, 100% of them were due to lack of MFA in the affected environments. I don't want to sit and say MFA will solve every problem. I won't sit and we could have a whole discussion around what kind of MFA is most useful, but just sheer lack of MFA affected how a client was impacted by these events. Something that simple had that much of an effect. And we get to see that by looking at these different data sets, working across organizations, and then pivoting things. So with that, Kevin, I'd like to kind of pass it back over to you for the larger discussion, but we just wanted to provide those as a straw man for us to kick around.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Before we go forward, I want in a second time, I want to give the opportunity for our 2 other speakers to give us their thoughts on these findings and how it relates to theirs. But first, I want to know about you, members of the audience. I want to know what you're most concerned about. So I will just launch the first poll questions before we start the conversation. Let me read. So my question is, what is your number 1 concern regarding cyber intrusions? So first answer is having business or operational data encrypted or leaked. Second is having personal data encrypted or leaked. Third is having to temporarily shut down operations. And the last one is industrial espionage. So I'll leave this poll for about 10 minutes and we'll see if we'll see the results that we get. And also I wanted to let the audience know, because we had a question about the webinar. All our webinars and online summit sessions are available on demand after the session. So for free, you just have to have an InfoSecurity magazine account. Jens, what did you think about the findings from Rubrik's report, and how does it relate to what you've seen?
So yeah, I think it's a fantastic report. And one of the things that really I think stood out, that something that I talk a lot about, and obviously coming from a Mandiant where we focus a lot on the attack life cycle, how do attackers succeed in their compromise, to how they move laterally, regardless of what sort of environment it is. To Stephen's point, it could be a cloud, it could be a hybrid, it could be on-prem or whatever. But one thing that really stood out that I've found very fascinating is the whole conversation around data. What does that really mean, right? What does it mean when we talk about the amount of data that we have? I typically refer to a sort of a digital footprint. And I liked it, what Stephen also highlighted, that most organizations today, they don't necessarily have the luxury and go back and see what they actually stored of information, how they stored it. Sometimes it's tied into specific users with specific privileges, and then the users leave, or maybe they forget about the data, right? But the data still lives and the information still live. And it's one of the things that we do see from a compromise perspective, that attackers, regardless of their motivations, is very successful in obtaining. And the consequences of obtaining that data obviously could be encryption, which have an immediate effect on an infrastructure, but it could also be information that might be leaked or manipulated, or might be sold or shared to other threat actors that might have a different purpose, right? And I think it's actually very important to highlight that amount of information that organizations store today, or the, as I refer to it, the increasing digital footprint that organizations and their employees and also us as individuals that we are leaving, right? I think that's something that I think is very important to highlight, because it ties into what the motivation is to attack organizations. It is because of the information that is available, or the access that the organization is providing. So I think that really stood out. And then the other thing that I think Stephen highlighted, which also trends very well to something that we don't necessarily explicitly say in our M-Trends report, but when we have the ability to identify the initial infection vector, how do attackers succeed in their initial compromise? Basically 70% of the initial infection vectors, once if we're able to identify them, they can be tied into a conversation around risk and business processes. So things like, for example, how do we deal with phishing? How do we deal with credentials? And how do we deal with having a modern or a up-to-date patching strategy? Because the attackers are obviously utilizing vulnerabilities, exploiting vulnerabilities in products. They are very successful in compromising organizations using phishing emails. And then lastly, the degree of how successful they are and the impact of the compromise really is tied down to user credentials, right? Sometimes it's very simple. It's all it requires is a static username and password that was stored somewhere, and then the attacker find it. Or it could be that an organization didn't do the due diligence and forgot to turn on or enable multi-factor authentication wherever it's possible, right? So it speaks very much into the business process and very much into what we are seeing from a compromise perspective.
Mm-hmm. And Deepan, you have focused on, or Zscaler and the Threat Lab and Zscaler Threat Labs have focused on phishing in their last report. So how do you tackle phishing then? No, but how does it relate, the findings from both the M-Trends report and Rubrik's report? How does it relate to what you found in terms of phishing?
Yeah, no, first of all, great reports. I think we are looking at different part of the kill chain. The way I look at it is most modern attacks are multi-stage attacks. right? They, as Yan mentioned as well, they may start with phishing. They may start with an exposed asset that is vulnerable to some zero day that the threat actors are leveraging. But above everything else, once they establish that initial foothold, be it through phishing, be it through vulnerability exploit, the maximum damage is done once they are in that initial asset. And that's where the lateral propagation phase comes in. This is where, I mean, it's a difference between a point incident versus an entire organization getting breached. So the way we're looking at the risk overall for organizations, and this, as Stephen mentioned as well, like we can't measure the risk. We can give them signals, we can give them all the telltale signs, and they have to then take into account how their environmental matrix is and come up with their own risk profile. But what are you doing to reduce your external attack surface? What are you doing to prevent that initial compromise phase? How are you reducing the blast radius? And then finally, they're all after data. That's what we saw in the report that Rubrik published as well. And every organization is at a different stage when it comes to their digital transformation or zero trust adoption journey. It is hybrid world right now. Even though the cloud adoption is increasing, I mean, we need to have a strategy in place that protects both on-prem as well as cloud environment. So the phishing report that we published, what we did in that quick overview of the data set and the method that the team leveraged, we looked at about 1.2 billion phishing blocks that were observed in 2022 across 7,000 plus global organizations. So these were all phishing attacks that were targeting enterprises. And we looked at both attacks that were delivered over TLS channel, attacks that were plain text. More than 90% of them were leveraging TLS channel, no surprise. They were also leveraging things like Microsoft, Azure, or Google, GCP, or AWS to host the phishing pages, right? And that's where they're trying to abuse the part where many of these vendors will provide wildcard TLS certificate for anything that's hosted on the cloud storage services that they offer. So 48% growth in overall phishing attacks year over year, and this is comparing 2021 to 2022. And Microsoft was one of the most targeted brand in terms of what they were trying to phish for, credentials for Office 365, SharePoint, OneDrive. And then in the later half, we also saw attacks which were specifically targeting assets like GitHub, where now they're not after individual information, but after the organization's IP information.
Mm-hmm. And this 47% rise really struck me because related to a conversation we had before the webinar with Jens. All these methods, obviously we also talk about sophisticated attacks and sometimes like sophisticated vulnerability exploits or multi-layered attack, but there's still the basic still works, seems like, from all your reports. So Jens, why do you think these attacks that are not always sophisticated are still successful?
So I think the maybe I'll probably try and address that question in two ways, right? So the cynical answer is it works. So why change it? You don't have to be very innovative when it comes to methods, because users, you sort of peek into users' interest, and I guess a longer and perhaps in a different webinar talking to human nature and how we are peaked in interesting things and that we might be receiving. But the other thing is also that I think from a motivation standpoint from the threat actor, you're always balancing your investments and your cost into your objectives. And if you're a cyber criminal, obviously you want to obtain your goals by gaining unauthorized access to an infrastructure, for example, but you don't necessarily want to invest a lot of money into sophisticated methods, because you also have a pretty good a return on investment calculation that shows that X amount of percent will likely engage with a phishing email, either click on an attachment or click on a URL or engage in any other way, even to the degree where they might even voluntarily give up their credentials, right? So I think those are the two reasons why we're seeing it, and I think it's also, should I say, part of the myth that we need to bust in terms of the sophistication. I think threat actors, regardless of their motivation, could be cyber criminals or state-sponsored cyber espionage campaigns. They are as sophisticated as they need to be in order to complete their mission, right? So if they don't need to be very sophisticated, if they don't need to be very customizable in their toolkits and all of that, if they can succeed by sending a phishing email, then they will do that because it's cheaper on time and labor and obviously on cost and investments.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to maybe dedicate a few minutes on ransomware, because we hear in the media that it's decreasing. If I read the M-Trends report, you can see that it's at least stagnating, maybe decreasing in terms of numbers. And at the same time, I see that Rubrik, in your Stephen, in your latest report, you focused a lot on ransomware. So could you tell us why it's still very much a threat? And there was like a quote from the report that I really liked, was ransomware happens in the middle of the story, not at the beginning or not at the end. It's part of the story, obviously. It's not just the only threat. But could you tell us why you focused partly on that and why it's still a threat?
Yeah, so I think there's some great questions and really good topics. I could talk all day on just kind of what's present there, but I'll throw a few things out. One is, I think it's no secret. I'm hesitant to even call it an assessment. Like, ransomware is here to stay. Someone's going to be doing ransomware, I think, in perpetuity forever. Who and the volume, we'll debate that as industry for a long time. But I don't think you'll find any credible expert that thinks this is going to go away. This is here to stay. So I think that's one thing we've got to understand. Second thing is, I think, and I'll go back to data bias, and I think the organizations in this call are a really good example. You speak to what you see. Well, part of that's going to be an influence on business. So I think we've got to be careful when we look at organizations. Ransomware has been around a long time. It's been prevalent for multiple years. So some organizations are getting better and some aren't, and that's affecting the data that we see as vendors. There's just no way around that. So I think we've got to be cognizant of that piece as well. The other piece I would say too is the attackers get a vote. Bad guys get an option as well. So as bigger, more mature organizations are getting better at dealing with ransomware, they'll just go somewhere else. It's not the same thing as a dedicated espionage effort where you need to target a specific organization. And we think we've seen that in the victimology. So I think it's shifting. Do I think it will always be as prevalent as it was in 2019 and 2020? I hope not, because we've put a lot of work into this across lots of organizations and making that better. And we're seeing the ripple effects of that. I mean, just even as an example, the number of ransomware used to be 100% synonymous with encryption malware. That's not the case anymore. We're seeing ransomware groups that just they're not getting a payment for encryption, but they are for threatening for data leaks. We're seeing some ransomware groups just delete data off altogether and say, if you want it back, I'll give it to you. I didn't encrypt it, I stole it, but I'll sell it back to you. So the adversary market is responding as well. But the thing I'd say to the question about ransomware is in the middle, I think that's really important. I think that's one of the biggest things I run across as a practitioner in this space is there's this mental model in a lot of people's heads that attackers show up and within minutes they're deploying ransomware, and then you either pay it or you don't, and then you're done. That is just never the case. And I think our three organizations are good examples. Deepan's organization is excellent at seeing that first step. That's, if you could measure the time from that to when ransomware is deployed, which is what Jens's organization does, it's significant. They're not just showing up and ransoming stuff in minutes. That's not what's happening. And we go through this in the Rubrik Zero Labs. There's a case study in this report. In that actual event, the attackers were there for 5 days. They spent 5 days getting comfortable. Then they spent a day really making sure they were ready to go. And then they deployed ransomware. And then on the other side, we talk about payment trends and are they successful? And we talk to external organizations, 70+% have paid a ransom at some point in their corporate history, but less than half got more than half of their data back from the attackers. So there's a tail on each side of ransomware deployment. And I think the big point is there's opportunities on each side of that. The more you're prepared from that initial email or whatever the initial intrusion vector is to ransomware deployment, that's opportunity to prevent encryption and data theft. Just because you got to that moment doesn't mean you're done. You have options to reduce impact. And I think that's the biggest thing that we can do in our space as experts on the vendor side is let's maximize those opportunities because they're there. They're there if we're ready to take them. If you're not, you're going to miss those opportunities. And that would be a real shame because there's real chances to lessen impact and stay resilient.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of adversaries and speaking of being in the middle, Deepan, you talked about a very interesting, sophisticated attack in your report. That's called the adversary in the middle attack. Could you tell us a bit more about this and maybe about other emerging techniques or emerging vectors that you see emerge within the bigger realm of phishing? There's obviously different types of phishing and different types of approaches.
Sure. Yeah. So what we've been seeing, and this is again not a net new thing, but the sophistication, the ease of use has really become much better. And I'm talking about phishing as a service, where they're literally taking on even an open phishing kit, open source phishing kit, and putting it in a way that most cyber criminals are able to pick it off the shelf, subscribe to it, and launch large-scale attacks. The campaign that we saw pick up steam last year was Adversary in the Middle campaign, where they're leveraging a phishing as a service. And there are many examples of it. Evil Proxy, I'm sure many of you guys are listening to us have heard about it. That is where they're literally doing man-in-the-middle proxy. This framework allows them to also fingerprint the victim environment, and I'm talking about the endpoint right now, where they will first fingerprint the endpoint, and based on the profile that they're trying to go after, the next redirect will serve the actual phishing page. Once the victim falls for that page and enters their user credentials, it also has the ability to then intercept the MFA authentication, right? That's where they're making a connection on your behalf with the end application, whether it's Microsoft, Google, right? And if you're not using a FIDO2-based MFA, they're actually able to establish connection and establish persistence with that SaaS app. The reason this thing has been super successful is beyond the ability to evade MFA. Everything that happens is fully automated. So once the user falls for it, they will take the authentication cookie. Within 6 minutes, the team, when we were tracking it, observed that the connection gets made to the user account, and they're able to leverage APIs of the SaaS vendor to exfil data in large amounts. So whether it's email, in case of GitHub, it was code repos being pulled from the victim's repository. So that was one of the more sophisticated attack. And it's, again, you won't be able to flag these kind of attacks unless you're man-in-the-middling, the man-in-the-middle attack, which is where you're doing TLS interception.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to leave the audience without talking about how organizations can adapt their security, and time is literally flying. So I'll just launch the second poll question. So the results of the first one, it was 70% of our audience then their number one concern is having business or operational data encrypted or leaked. So clearly, it's not just ransomware, but yeah, you can see how these kind of threats are still very much in the minds of everyone. I'll launch the other question. I actually want to know. So I picked some of the processes that you can implement in your organization that you are mentioning in Rubrik's report, Stephen. So incident response plan is one of the possibility. We will talk about them and probably others, but incident response plan, backups and data recovery orchestration, and zero trust initiative. So these three processes can help mitigate or remediate a breach. So I want to ask our audience if their organization is mature in all of these processes, 2 of these, 1 of these, none of these, or if it has started implementing some of each or some of them, but don't consider them mature in any of them yet. So I'll just start the poll now. Yeah, that's launched. Jens, what do you think is key? What would be, if there's one thing, if you have just one thing to say about how do you prepare or how do you anticipate data breaches, ransomware attacks, all these attacks that typically wants your data, what would be the number one thing to do?
Yeah, so I mean, and obviously I'll put a disclaimer on it because I'm very biased here, right? So for me, it starts really with what sort of threat context do you have that you can act upon, or translate it into intelligence that I sit in every day. I think it's really important that we try, when you look at the attack surface area for any sort of cyber threats today, it's clearly too big to focus on everything or give the same thing the same amount of priority. So we really have to try and narrow that, scope down into what is most relevant or what is causing the biggest impact to our organization. And this ties into something that I think Stephen highlighted that is a very good point. This is not just a conversation on threats. It is also how do we marry the threat landscape into a risk conversation that organizations need to have. And Stephen is absolutely right. We cannot, as external experts, provide the risk landscape to organizations. They need to come with that. Now, what we can help them with, obviously, all of us here, is also marry what we know about the external threat into what they know about their internal data set and their internal risk. We cannot say what matters most to organizations. They should be able to identify that, right? So how can we narrow down the surface area for attacks and allow organizations to focus on what is causing the biggest impact, regardless of being espionage or cybercrime or whatever it might be? I would say that's probably the key thing that I would say. Understand your adversaries, and then secondly, understand what they're after and how they have been successful in the past.
Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I love that question. I agree with everything Jens said. I think the thing we'd really talk about is you've got to create capacity to step through this. And I know that sounds really simple, but it is. So, I'll kind of go back to a couple of the data points we got from those external leaders. 96% of them are concerned about their ability to maintain business continuity in the coming year. It's not a knock on anybody. That's really qualified experts saying, we're not sure we're going to be able to pull this off. That should grab our attention. The other piece I would say that is those same leaders are having to deal with about a breach a week at their level, about 52 times on average. As we talk with these folks, those people rarely have that built into their daily routine. So they're either working that during the day and then doing their day job nights and weekends, or vice versa. So the biggest thing I think we can do is create capacity. Like it's the assume breach mentality. It's breaches are inevitable. And that doesn't mean be prepared to be a victim. That's not what we're saying. We're saying you have to create capacity to deal with this in your daily routine. Once you do that, now you can figure out the right answer. Maybe you're a small, relatively immature organization. You need to work on some fundamentals. Maybe you're a Fortune 50 and you've got a lot of resources and it's about fine tuning. I don't know. That the organizations will know that. But I have yet to see an organization that tells us, you know what, we're killing this. We've got time on our hands. I've never once heard that. What I've always heard is there's more we want to do. We just can't get to it. Or we would love to study this more, or we need to understand this more. And a data point I would give, not a data point, an analogy I would give is, and I don't want to make this a Rubrik pitch, but one of the things that we built into our platform is the ability to do orchestrated recovery, to sequence out, to take a playbook and literally put in the technology and then just push a button later on. most organizations don't use that feature because they don't have that playbook. So they want that all of a sudden when they're in the middle of the intrusion. You know, when that phishing email goes through and it's successful, when you've got to call that incident response firm, you really want those. It's too late. You're not going to get to do that now. So there's lots of opportunities to build in these things, but people just don't have time. So that's the biggest thing I would say is create that space at each level. Create it for the leaders, create it for the teams, create it for the boards, because this problem's here. It's not going away. So let's get our arms around that and then let organizations figure out the best answer for themselves.
And there's one number that I remember on the top of my head from not the last report from Rubrik, but the one in fall 2022. I think it was 92% of IT leaders that were concerned that if they were falling victim, if their organization were falling victim to a cyber attack, they would not be able to keep business continuity. So do you think the message is not gone to the right people? Because I feel like even this Zoom breach, I think maybe deepen. You can talk about zero trust later on. This is, I would say, not that new. So what do you think is, Stephen? What do you think is still missing for the right people to implement to do what you just talked about?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to right decision maker. I think we've gotten much better, and Deepan would know the CISO world much better than I would as a CISO. I think we've gotten better at that. I think where I see like what we expect out of CISOs and CIOs over the last decade, demonstrably improved. What I don't see is now we're expecting that role to solve everything, which isn't appropriate either. And I'll go back to the risk and resiliency discussion. I don't know a CISO yet that's qualified to make a operational risk decision. It's not their job. It's literally not their role. You wouldn't ask that CISO of that if the question wasn't cyber. So we're not bringing all of the resources that we have to bear. Once we do, we're going to move a lot quicker. And the organizations, and you see this a lot after the breach, once organizations bring more resources in to do their day jobs, all of a sudden, lots of problems start getting solved very, very quickly. As one example I'll give is like external communication. We never talked about that on breaches. Nobody went public on breaches. Now people are. And so the communication team is typically doing it for the first time at the worst possible moment. And then they get better for the next one. The more of those things we do, I think that's going to be the key. That's how we're going to really solve this is stop asking the cyber experts to solve what are effectively non-cyber issues inside of this technology problem.
Do you think it's time for CISOs in all organizations to actually be considered as C-suite members? Because I've read a lot that sometimes CISOs are not considered as such, and they're considered very like operational, but not. Do you think that's true? And do you think it's time to change that?
So I'll keep my answer super short because I would love to hear Deepan's perspective on this as a global CISO. But my short answer is yes. I think it's way past time.
Deepan, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's already happening. I mean, look, in many of the organizations, many of my peers that I talk to, the trend has changed. It was true maybe a couple of years back, as recent as that, but things are changing on that front. Even the point that Stephen was mentioning about resiliency, I'm starting to see new positions, like chief resiliency officer, because it's a real problem, right? You can't have the same person who's responsible for the overall security also now look into business continuity, resiliency aspect of the organization. So yeah, I mean, look, CISOs, the three priorities that I continue to hear. Number one is what are we doing to protect the crown jewels, the data that matters to the organization, and the risk aspect is ransomware, phishing, nation-state adversary, cyber espionage, right? And this is where the conversation with board, conversation with CEO and other business partners play a very important role in prioritizing what is needed. The capacity point that Stephen made, again, you need to prioritize resources to the problems that the modern enterprises face today. And that's where CISOs are the liaison between what needs to happen, what needs to be prioritized, bringing the right set of problems in front of the right audience, and then taking it through. The problem that I see most is everyone realizes that, say, I'll take Zero Trust as an example. We need to implement Zero Trust architecture, but it's not a flip of a switch. It's a journey, right? And you need to continue working on different aspects of Zero Trust. For the one point that Stephen mentioned, assume breach scenario, that's the core fundamental of implementing Zero Trust. Right, so I'll go back to the 4 points I mentioned to wrap this one on my side on Zero Trust. What are you doing to reduce your external attack surface? This is where the adversaries will target you. Are you able to implement consistent security inspection no matter where your users are? We talked about hybrid environment, whether they're working from home, whether they're in office, whether they're at any of the conferences, like we were all at RSA, most of us were. Third piece, very, very important. What is your blast radius if the adversary were able to compromise that single asset? This is the assumed breach scenario. If the answer to that is they're able to move laterally in your environment or get to your crown jewel application, then you need to prioritize your segmentation strategy, right? That's the core component of Zero Trust. And then finally, they're all after your data. So what kind of security controls do you have in place, both inline as well as out of band, as well as something like data encryption or data security? How are you protecting the data that matters to your organization if there was a assumed breach scenario and bad guys are able to get to the systems that hold your sensitive information?
Jens, did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, and this is especially on the whole thing around CISOs and responsibility and all of that, I would also say, and this is certainly after speaking to many CISOs and sitting in advisory boards, is that we also, especially us as practitioners, we also have to look a bit inward, saying, well, what are we actually bringing to the decision makers, right? Because I see in many cases, we as practitioners might zoom in on, a cool exploit or a cool way an attacker got compromised, or an attacker compromised the infrastructure of that. And the decision makers, and certainly, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of CISOs, obviously, but we also have to frame or picture, well, what sort of risk relevant impact conversation are they able to bring to their stakeholders? Because detection metrics and how much bad stuff you're keeping out doesn't necessarily mean a lot, right? What means a lot is, what are you doing to minimize the impact and the business risk, so we can continue our operations as a business, right? So we as practitioners also need to navigate and find a better way of conveying these type of messages to the stakeholders. It's not always, certainly I don't find that CISOs or the leadership don't care about threats, but they simply don't have a good way of speaking to stakeholders on it, because they are not always getting the right information at the right time, right?
And any tips to speak the truth and to make your message go through and understood by the board?
I think I'll leave that actually to Stephen, because we've had conversations on this, and I think you have some excellent points on that, Stephen.
Yeah, so most of my career has been very much this topic, like engaging C-suites and board of directors on what's occurred and what it means. And that's very much, I would love to say, had the right answers because we're all super smart, but it's been like reconning by fire. We've learned a lot of lessons the hard way. And the thing that always stuck with me is we were presenting an intrusion to this 4-star general one time, and he stopped every one of us and he said, everybody has 2 levers you can pull. Every job, no matter how small or how big, there's only like 2 or 3 things that you can do. So tell me what you want me to do with my levers. And like no one in the room had anything for this 4-star general. Like it became, in essence, we were wasting that person's time. And I've seen that a lot with board of director levels. They have immense capability to do things, but they can't do everything. So what is it that they can do? What do we want them to do? And then also, how do we potentially put another lever in front of them? how do we say, you want to be able to do this and you can't? Sorry, I hear it all the time in breaches. I'm sure Deepan and Jens have heard the same thing. I know Jens has for sure because we've been in some of these same rooms. Like, well, I want to do this. Well, that's not an option. Sorry, that'd be great, but it's too late. So how do you influence what they can do, and how do you build more capability in for them? And once we start approaching these topics that way, the answers end up looking very, very different. And I'll throw rocks at our own report that we just did, this new Rubrik Zero Labs report. One of the things we did at RSA was we presented to our CISO advisory board, and we didn't present the report. We walked through, here's how we're talking about it, here's why we did this, and we asked them for feedback. And we got some critical feedback. There are some things like, yeah, I'm never going to use that with the board ever. So we're like, okay, great. What would you? What are your problems? What are you trying to solve? And so again, not to make it sound too cute, but you've got to understand who you're talking to, what they can do, what they can't do, and then help guide them to what they should do. And again, that sounds so easy, and it's not. It's incredibly difficult, but it starts with listening. It starts with listening and paying attention versus showing up and being the expert. Everyone assumes we're experts. That's why we're all here. It's how do I convert that to what this person actually needs? And as soon as we do that, we end up being really, really successful and powerful.
Mm-hmm. And now it gets even more complicated because you have to tell them about the threats posed by AI, generative AI as well. So, and on that note, what do you think? How do you think all this will evolve? Like, let's say an organization has all the basics right, has probably started their journey with zero trust. What is coming up? So, is that AI everything, automation, cloud migration? Is that also going to? I'm guessing it's a yes, but how is it going to play a big role in data security? And maybe other topics that you think are going to be emerging in the next few years. Anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I can start. So look, AI ML, I mean, especially the large language models that everyone's talking about, I'm sure every conversation that, in fact, I had last week, it came up. It has tremendous potential, and we're going to see a lot of application both on improving productivity, improving some of the workflows, making it more efficient. But then we are also going to see application of that on the other side, where the threat actors are also going to use it, right, to target things like vulnerability in the code, to spin up phishing pages, localized language usage, right? All of that is super easy for them as well. So we are going to see threat landscape leveraging AI ML. It's already happening, but with the LLM, I think we're going to see some interesting use cases. We're already starting to track a few threats where that is evolving. The other two priorities that I'll call out is supply chain attacks. We saw one this year, didn't turn out to be that big, 3CX, because it was only impacting endpoints. Supply chain attacks, especially the one where I think Mandiant came out and described how it was a domino effect, right? It started with something, and there was a downstream supply chain attack targeting 3CX, and then it went further down. So multi-tiered supply chain attacks will be another thing to watch out for. And then final point I'll make is public cloud. I mean, everyone has that migration in progress. Some are further along than the other. It will be hybrid, but protecting public cloud environment will remain critical for all organizations, because we know how to protect things that are on-prem because of decades of experience. Many of these organizations who are using their legacy infrastructure and migrating to cloud, they're not as much of an expert when it comes to protecting cloud native workloads. And that's where threat actors are continuing to take advantage of the situation. So that's the third area of prioritization.
Thank you, Deepan. Jensen and Stephen, I will ask you to be a bit shorter if you can, because time is running out. I don't want us to be kicked out. So if you have maybe, how do you think the data threats to organizations is going to evolve in three words, if you can?
So I can be very quick, and I'll let Stephen wrap up. So I'll say, from a capability perspective, automate what you can, and to Deepan's point, understand the threat landscape and see how you can actually minimize it, right? And then cloud is not going to go away, hybrid, on-prem, and all of that. But one thing that we actually do see under the Google Cloud and the reports we put out is that don't carry, should I say, bad business processes into the cloud. And I say that because the number one thing that we do see cloud breaches are due to misconfigurations, right? So we need to change the business processes and better understand them, I would say.
Yeah, and I'll just give two answers which are absolutely going to conflict. I think AI, especially generative AI, is going to change the world. I really think it's going to be a powerful, powerful tool. On the other hand, I think this is always going to be about users and data. I don't think it's going to change that aspect. We've all seen a lot of technologies come in that have changed the world, but we're still talking about users and data like I would be willing to bet every one of us has from the beginning. So I think we've got to focus there while we're also in this rapidly changing, exciting world. And who knows what's on the other side of generative AI.
Mm-hmm. And we'll make sure to invite you all for another talk on this. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you every member of our audience as well. And we'll see you on another webinar, maybe in a few months' time, talking about generative AI and security. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, everyone. Thanks for that awesome discussion. I learned a lot, and I think our attendees did too. I mean, this landscape is changing all the time. New threats are coming up, so you really have to be prepared. You have to know what's coming if you're going to stay ahead of them and keep the bad guys away. And I think that really got out there today, and some fantastic knowledge that we learned. So that does it for the discussion. But before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business, and it's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And we do have a winner. The winner of today's $250 Amazon gift card is Alan Herman from Texas. Congratulations to you, Alan. We'll be in touch very soon to get you your card. And with that, we are wrapped, everyone. On behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik for making this event possible. And I want to thank all of you for being here, for attending, for your great questions. And it's always a pleasure to be here with you. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.